So this is the last meditation meeting of the year. And in the last month, in the month of November, Kriya Yoga Awareness Month, at the end of that month, I posted a video reel onto Instagram encouraging people who are listening to define some goals, long-term goals. And I described these as being long-term measurable goals. And then as a response to that, there was some inquiry into how would that look in terms of our practice. And so these few words here today are just a means to provide and facilitate more reflection on how we relate to a practice, and specifically on how we relate to our practice in terms of setting goals for ourselves. So I came up with a title for today's talk, and it was Getting Tripped Up by Your Goals. And the idea is that we are inclined in today's society to be very goal-orientated, very focused on the results and the outcomes of our experiences. And we do this sometimes to our own detriment, or we do it to such a point that we are not able to appreciate the process. So here there might be a capacity to describe this in relation to process versus product. Having been involved in education, this is something which is commonly discussed. Education systems around the world for a long time focused on product. Exams, end-of-year exams, end of school life exams. Everything was based on the product. What was going to mark and account for every occasion, every learning, every insight that was experienced along the way was going to be marked in one final product. And this tendency to evaluate the processes which we're engaged in and how we progress through them is creeped into many aspects of our lives. And so we've been conditioned to engage in life in this way. Engage in life in the way where the end result is given greater priority or greater importance than the process which facilitates it being manifested in the first place. Science has done a great deal to help quantify certain aspects of our physical world. And so it endorses this idea that by doing such and such, then you're going to have this outcome. And many other disciplines within our modern world incorporate this approach. I like to call it the 2 + 2 = 4 approach. Of course, it could be 3 = 6 or 4 + 4 = 8. But it's just this notion that you take this step, you take that step, and then you're going to have this result. And in many regards, this is how we've been brought up to look at life. This is how we've been conditioned. But we just need to take a look around us to see how this is backfiring. There are generations of young people now who have aspirations to progress as they have been told they would be able to progress. If they do X and they do Y, then they can achieve Z. But many of these individuals are doing or have done X and have done Y, but are experiencing a great deal of anxiety, unrest, by the fact that it doesn't look like they're going to be able to achieve Z. And we can look at this in Ireland specifically. We have a housing crisis, but many countries are experiencing this in the Western world. We look at it in terms of study. If you apply yourself, if you dedicate time and you invest your efforts into learning a specific topic, becoming specialized in it, then you'll be able to progress and get a job in that area. But now we can see that that's not necessarily true. There is a chance that even that specific area that you have focused so much time and effort in may become redundant, outdated, no longer needed. And so the idea that 2 + 2 = 4 is very much relied upon within the way we as a society engage with the world. And it gives the idea a certain sense of certainty, control. It reassures us in a way where we're left feeling comforted. Until such point we come to the realization that it wasn't actually all true, or it wasn't the case. So when we look at our lives, we can divide them up, or we can use the model of the koshas to reflect on how we exist, dividing up our existence, using this model into its different aspects. And the outermost layer is that of the material world, the physical body. And so within the domain of the physical world, this is how we operate. 2 + 2 = 4. And it can be argued that this is how it works. You press a switch, then the light comes on. You walk for an hour, you'll move 4 to 5 kilometers. You dance all night, you'll feel tired. So there is a general understanding and appreciation for this to hold a certain amount of truth. But there are many variables at play. And I think one way to reflect upon this is just in relation to the notion of moving through the school system, acquiring an education, and moving on towards work life. You may invest many hours and be very diligent in your application, self-application, so as to acquire information and develop your skills. But it's not to say that you're going to be the person who gets the job, because there are many, many other variables at play. All the other people who had invested their time and energy into acquiring skill in the same discipline. And that's one variable. The variable of what the actual needs of the company are. The variable of how the people who are sitting behind the interview desk, the interview panel, how each one of them take to you. There are many different variables at play. So simplifying it into, if we do this and do that, then we're going to get this, is reassuring. It offers us a sense of comfort. It calms our need for certainty. But it is not in line with the way things unfold. And when we think of life as it is unfolding, and a young infant who comes into the world, you talk to a physician or somebody specialized in working with young children, or even a parent, and you ask them, when does a child usually start to walk? While there might be a general idea of when a child starts to walk, when a particular child starts to walk can never be known. It may fall within that time range that a child begins to walk, but the specific time, how long is it going to take before they're on their 2 feet and they're taking their first step, that can't be fully known. And we're left wondering why. Or we can ask ourselves why. And we're led to our own conclusions. The same question can be asked in relation to, when does a child actually articulate its first understandable sentence or phrase? And again, there might be a general consensus of when it usually happens, which turns into when it should be happening in terms of the child's development. But when a particular child, one specific child, actually is able to do that, can't be predicted. Because there are so many variables at play. And so while science, and maybe you want to say child psychology, is able to specify a specific time range for when these events happen, and that gives a sense of reassurance and certainty, as a parent, that moment is a very significant moment. For a parent to be able to witness their child's first step is important in terms of the experience of what a shared moment. When the child utters their first phrase, of course, it doesn't happen just like that. There's a building up towards it. And the parent has been there, or the guardian has been there to support and facilitate this. So when it eventually happens, that product is a celebration of everything that has been enjoyed, worked upon, connecting, bringing the two together, bringing the guardian and the child together. So the product marks a significant moment. The uttering of a phrase marks a significant moment. The first step marks a significant moment. But it's a moment which represents everything that has gone before. So when we're talking about setting long-term measurable goals, we have to be careful. Specifically because we're talking about these in relation to our spiritual practices. Now already we've seen within the world, the practical world, if you want to call it that, the practical world that is the domain of physical interaction, there's already a capacity to be able to mismeasure things. And so ideally, you could say, I'm going to save X amount of money every month so that after 2 years, I'm going to be able to buy such and such a thing. And that's all well and good. But it relies on variables such as having a regular source of income, not having unforeseen costs, not slipping because of your own tendency to maybe splash out once in a while. So there are variables. And so we're already within the physical domain where we're being practical. There are variables at play which are outside of our control. These variables are also influenced when we talk about splashing out. What's splashing out? If we're going to spend our money and actually get in our own way of saving the money in accord with our own plan, what is it that's driving that? Maybe we deserve a holiday, so we splash out a little bit. Or maybe it's a friend's birthday, so we splash out to get them a gift. Or maybe it's just that we have a tendency to spend a little bit too much when we go food shopping. We find it difficult not to. So now there's variables at play which are more related to something more subtle. It's within our control. We have control. We can choose to buy a present or not. We can choose to go on the holiday or not. But there's other factors at play which are, as we may call them, more subtle. And then when we talk about the tendency to overspend when we go shopping, or maybe it's a tendency to want to give money away to others, or maybe it's a tendency to buy new things, whatever it might be. But it's a tendency, it's a habit. And then we can look at that as a habit, as being another driving factor which is influencing your achieving your goal. But it's a driving factor which is subtle, even more subtle. So the variables at play in terms of achieving a goal within the realm of the physical world is being influenced and acted upon and determined by many, many different factors, many variables. And some of these can be extremely subtle, and some of them can intersect one with the other. Because of course you're talking about one goal. But we're not the kind of people who like to have one goal, are we? We like to have several goals. And quite often, as we work through these goals and the variables which is interfering with our being able to achieve them, at a subtle level, those influencing factors, those drives which are getting in the way, may be more and more aligned. So at the most physical level, our goals are quite distinct. Maybe it's save money, maybe it's acquire a new skill, maybe it's get better at meditating, maybe it's sit for longer in our practice, maybe it's to stop watching so much TV, these kind of things. But the factors, the variables at play, at a physical level, they might be quite different. But as we work back to the driving influences, what's at the core is similar. So when we're talking about long-term measurable goals and tripping up over ourselves, if we don't know what's going on at more subtle levels, or if we're not even trying to neutralize the effect of what's going on at more subtle levels, then that stuff will continue playing out. In modern parlance or in modern talk, people talk about it as self-sabotage or sabotaging oneself. So now we want to bring this back to the idea of defining and setting out long-term measurable goals in terms of our practice. And our practice, well, what is our practice? We can have measurable goals such as I'm going to endeavor to meditate for an extra session every day. And that's something which is measurable, quite definable. It could be that I'm going to spend 15 minutes extra every week or every day reading some spiritual text. These are measurable goals, definable. But in terms of the result, what is the result? The result is that you've meditated extra, that you've read more. Is that the result we're going for? So we can understand how we can measure things at a practical level in terms of the action that we're doing. But how do you measure your own progress in relation to your spiritual practice? And to maybe talk about this and reflect on it more, we'll have to look at what our spiritual practice actually is. And fundamentally, spiritual practice is a practice of self-inquiry. You're inquiring into your nature, your essence. Now, this can go off on many different tangents, but we appreciate that we exist and express at many different levels. And using again the framework of the koshas, you've got the physical, the emotional or energetic, the mental, the intellectual, and then the core, our inner essence. So self-inquiry is a process that we engage in so as to be able to gain insight into how our expressing at these different levels is just that, an expression, but it's coming from a core source. And so our inquiry is guiding us and facilitating our being able to work back to this core source. So if that's our practice, how do we know if we're getting close to achieving that, or becoming, if we want to talk about it as a goal, to achieving that as a goal? Well, in order to work back to be able to appreciate that core source, we need to overcome the restlessness, the distraction which is getting between our being able to appreciate that and keeping us away from appreciating that. So to say it another way, our practice is neutralizing the effect, which is occurring at all the other levels, physical, emotional, mental, so that we can move towards experiencing our innermost essence. But that process of working through and arriving at that experience of our beingness without identification, as we do that, we're naturally going to experience an effect of that on how it expresses at a mental, emotional, physical level. To say it quite succinctly, our engaging in the practice, our engaging in self-inquiry is going to facilitate clarity, our ability to see. As we move closer to appreciating our innermost essence without interruption, then the more we experience this capacity to see with clarity as we express using our mental faculties, through the energetic responses in the body, and through our physical engagement with the world. So clarity and the capacity to see clearly is the result. And so when we're setting long-term goals, measurable goals, and now we're no longer talking about them in terms of those practical things that I spent 40 minutes doing this and I've done this thing twice a week. We're looking at measuring it in relation to our seeing more clearly. Now, it might sound abstract, but if we are seeing more clearly, then how we experience life is with more clarity, less conflict. So the goals that we set to achieve that, they're not the kind of goals which are related to what we've been talking to previously. 2 + 2 = 4 goals. They're more akin to the child taking its first step or speaking its first phrase. This is not time-bound. And that's something we have to take into consideration. It's not a case of our engaging in this practice, meditating more, meditating harder, and that will achieve it within a quicker time. Time is not what defines the result manifesting. I myself, my own life, when I was going to CSA during the summers, Center for Spiritual Awareness, founded by royeugenedavis, I approached it like that. If I meditate more, meditate harder, do more kriyas, I'll get there quicker. Now, it's not to say that meditation doesn't facilitate a capacity to inquire. It does. But just because I'm doing more doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to work through or neutralize all of that stuff which is preventing or had prevented me from having clarity. It's not time related. It's related to the actual neutralization of that effect. So like the child who's going to utter their first phrase, there's a lot that has to be contended with, first of all. Moving the muscles in the mouth, hearing the sounds, mimicking the sounds, getting it accurate, taking on the meaning of certain words, the associated meaning. What does mommy mean? What does daddy mean? Knowing that the word that's being uttered is referring to a specific thing. Then being able to move the muscles in the mouth the right way so as to form a sound and utter these sounds in a sequence which ends up being something which can be comprehended and understood by a listener, their guardian. There's a lot of investment there. And when that is achieved, is not based on time. It's based on effort. It's based on willingness. It's based on input, investment into the process. And that's what it comes down to. Investment into the process. Investing in the practice of self-inquiry. And so when we set aside and we say, well, I'm going to set a long-term measurable goal, and that measurable goal is that I'm going to write in my journal for 30 minutes at least once a week. I'm going to do that. Or I'm going to sit for 2 hours extra once a week in my meditation practice. And you do that. This is fine. It's supporting and it's facilitating the inquiry. But it can't be expected that that is going to equal something. It's contributing towards it. It's working towards it. But it can't be expected that just because you do that, that you're going to have a result. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. And this comes back to the idea of process and product. Self-inquiry. The inquiry of the self, of its true nature. But we are always going to be confronted with the expressions of the self. We're always going to be navigating how we engage and interact with life through these expressions of the self. We're going to use the subject pronoun I. We're going to talk about me. We're going to talk about the things in our lives, our experiences. And so we're always going to have, while we are embodied within this domain, we're always going to have an experience of the self which exists at a physical, emotional, and a mental level. So the self-inquiry, the inquiring into our innermost nature and our true self, that inquiry as a process will continue. And the reflection can be in relation to how the product and the process are interrelated. The awakening in insight, the awakening to greater clarity, is experienced in the process. As these processes and the process of self-inquiry is engaged on a moment-to-moment basis. So enlightenment or awakening or realization of the self isn't something at the end, after a period of time. It's in every moment. It's a continuous realization of the self. So it's not a case of setting a goal for something which, if you do X, Y, and Z, then you're going to achieve it. The goal is achievable now. The realization of the self is possible right now. Now, I've heard other people say this, and when it is heard, it can sound a bit abstract. Well, if that's the point, why set up goals at all? Why get engaged with the process at all? What am I even doing here listening to you? Or the other questions that arise is, well, if that's the case, why is it so difficult? How come I haven't experienced it already? And this is where the idea of process and product is one which needs to be reflected upon. When you engage in something for your spiritual practice, when you're engaging for the practice of inquiring into the self, into your essential nature, into who you are, not just as an expressing self at the physical, emotional, and mental level, but as a core self, a witnessing self, which observes all of that. You engage in that, and that engaging in and of itself is allowing you to experience the self, is facilitating your experiencing the self. why haven't you done so? Or why doesn't it feel like that? Why doesn't it feel like you've realized the self? And this will be referred to as identifications. Because the tendency to identify with the expressions is stronger than the tendency to identify with the core source. But like the child who's trying to learn to exercise how to move their mouth so as to form those sounds, so as to utter those syllables, to make those words, to make the phrase. You're investing in shifting where you put your identification. So everything that comes to you in life, everything, is an experience which offers the capacity to know the self. And the formal practices you put in place, I like to describe them like an incubator, a secluded space where you get to exercise your capacity to inquire. And then you may have formal practices such as writing and reading and all of these different things. But all of these different things are going to resonate with you at a physical, emotional, and mental level. And so we can be encouraged to know that they're not it. They're just guiding the process, help facilitating your engaging in the process. The process being self-inquiry. And the self then that's inquired into to the point where that's where attention flows. That's where the identity is found. Then that self is realized. And as you move to identifying more and more with that innermost essence, there's going to be a sense of clarity, a sense of seeing more clearly. And in the meantime, as you're working through it, there can be the opposite. Sense of confusion and conflict. But you can know that in that process of applying yourself, whether it be in formal practice or informal practice, if you're inquiring, then you are sticking to the goal. And when it comes to December of 2025 and you ask yourself, well, how do I measure my progress? You're not measuring it on time. You're measuring it on your own experiencing greater clarity.